The first time an American soldier truly noticed the German folding shovel, it wasn't during a calm moment of digging or camp preparation, but in a sudden, violent encounter where instinct mattered more than orders. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the kind that burned the lungs and made every breath feel borrowed. Somewhere in the rubble of a shattered European village, a German soldier lunged forward, his rifle useless in the cramped space. Instead of retreating, he reached down, snapped open a compact metal tool and swung. The fight ended almost instantly. For those who witnessed it, the image never faded. A shovel was not supposed to do that, yet it had. And it did so with terrifying efficiency. That single moment captured the curiosity of American troops who had been trained to see equipment as tools with fixed purposes, not extensions of survival itself. As reports filtered through the ranks, stories began to circulate about the Klappspaten, the German folding shovel carried by nearly every infantryman. It was compact, hinged, and cleverly designed to fold flat against the body. To American eyes, it looked like another example of German engineering, practical and efficient, but not revolutionary. The United States Army already had entrenching tools, after all. Digging foxholes was universal. What many failed to grasp was that German soldiers were taught something very different from the start of their training. The Klappspaten was introduced not merely as a digging implement, but an object that could save a man's life when everything else was gone. Instructors demonstrated how it could be gripped, swung, and thrust. They spoke openly about moments when rifles jammed, ammunition ran dry, or silence was required. In those moments, the shovel became a weapon. American doctrine did not encourage such thinking. U.S. soldiers were trained extensively with firearms, bayonets, and grenades. The entrenching tool was there to protect them from artillery, small arms fire, to shape the earth into a barrier between life and death. The idea of sharpening a shovel edge or practicing strikes with it felt unnecessary, even barbaric to many officers. War, in the American view, was about firepower, coordination, and overwhelming force. Close combat was something to avoid, not prepare for with improvised weapons. When American engineers examined captured German equipment, they admired the folding mechanism, the durability, and the way it saved space in a pack. They decided to copy it, believing the design itself was the secret. Factories back home soon produced American versions of the folding shovel, nearly identical in appearance. It folded the same way, locked into place with a similar hinge, and was issued widely. On paper, the problem seemed solved, yet something invisible was missing. The German Klappspaten came with a philosophy shaped by years of brutal trench warfare, street fighting, and the harsh lessons of survival. German soldiers were taught to expect chaos, to assume that plans would fail, and to be ready to fight with whatever was in their hands. The shovel was just one part of that mindset, but it symbolized a deeper understanding of combat at its most personal level. American soldiers, by contrast, often joked about their shovels. They complained about the weight, cursed them when digging in frozen ground, and used them as seats or makeshift tables. Very few thought of them as weapons. When close combat happened, and it did happen often, Americans relied on bayonets or simply tried to bring their rifles to bear. In narrow trenches or collapsed buildings, this was not always possible. German troops, trained to transition instantly, used their Klappspaten with practiced brutality. The edge could be sharpened in minutes. The reinforced blade could crush bone through a helmet. It was not elegant, but it was effective. Stories from the front began to reveal this difference more clearly. American patrols entering abandoned German positions sometimes found shovels with edges worn smooth, not from digging but from repeated sharpening. Veterans later recalled seeing comrades fall in sudden, silent encounters where no shots were fired. These moments were shocking, because they contradicted the idea that modern war was fought at range. The Klappspaten represented something older and more primal, a reminder that technology did not erase the need for raw violence at close quarters. Still, this realization rarely translated into changes in training. The American Army was massive, structured, and slow to adapt its philosophy once the war was underway. There was also a cultural divide. German military tradition emphasized obedience, discipline, and readiness for extreme measures. Soldiers were conditioned to accept the idea that survival justified almost anything. American forces, drawn largely from civilians, carried different assumptions. Many had never imagined striking another human being with a shovel. The thought was unsettling, even if it might save their lives. Training focused on marksmanship and teamwork, reinforcing the belief that proper planning and firepower would prevent such desperate situations. When American officers discussed German tactics, they often framed them as evidence of brutality rather than adaptability. Yet on the battlefield, theory rarely survived contact with reality. Urban fighting in Europe collapsed distances and turned streets into tunnels of rubble. Trenches twisted and narrowed until rifles became awkward clubs. In these moments, the German Klappspaten was already in hand, already understood. The American copy hung from belts and packs, unused except for digging. It was the same steel, the same hinge, but not the same thing at all. The difference lay not in the metal, but in the mind of the soldier carrying it. Some American veterans eventually learned the lesson the hard way. After surviving close encounters, a few began sharpening their own shovels, quietly adopting techniques they had seen or heard about. These were individual adaptations, not official doctrine. They spread through whispered advice rather than manuals. Even so, they never became widespread. The war moved too fast, and the American industrial machine focused on producing tanks, planes, and guns, not rethinking the role of a humble tool. The folding shovel remained a piece of equipment, not a symbol of last-ditch survival. The irony was that America had recognized the usefulness of German design, but only on a surface level. Engineers copied what they could measure: size, weight, folding angle. They did not copy what could not be easily quantified: the training hours spent practicing silent strikes, the acceptance that a shovel might be used to kill. This gap revealed a larger truth about warfare. Equipment alone does not determine outcomes. How soldiers are taught to think under pressure matters just as much, if not more. By the time the war reached its final stages, countless American soldiers carried folding shovels that looked nearly identical to the Klappspaten. To an outside observer, the two armies seemed to have converged in design, but beneath that similarity lay a fundamental difference. German troops had been taught to see every object as potential salvation or death. Americans were taught to rely on systems, coordination, and superior firepower. When those systems failed, Germans reached for whatever was closest, already knowing how to use it. Americans hesitated, often because no one had ever told them that a shovel could be anything more than a tool. The first encounter that sparked American curiosity about the Klappspaten was not unique. It was repeated in different forms across Europe, from muddy fields to ruined cities. Each time, it left the same impression on those who survived. The Germans had found a way to turn simplicity into lethality. Yet the lesson remained incomplete. Copying the show was easy. Copying the mindset behind it was not. That difference would linger long after the war ended, shaping how veterans remembered combat and how historians later interpreted the small details that separated life from death in the chaos of World War II. As the fighting intensified and the war dragged deeper into Europe, the contrast between German and American use of the folding shovel became impossible to ignore for those who survived long enough to notice patterns. Night patrols, sudden ambushes, and confused clashes in ruined towns revealed a truth that official reports rarely captured. German soldiers did not wait for combat to become desperate before adapting. They expected desperation as a normal condition of war. The Klappspaten was always part of that expectation, resting quietly at the soldier's side, not as a backup tool, but as a final answer when noise, distance, or malfunction removed every other option. German training emphasized proximity. Recruits were taught that battles often collapsed into moments measured in breaths rather than minutes. Instructors demonstrated how silence could be more valuable than firepower, especially during infiltration or defense at night. The folding shovel fit perfectly into this doctrine. Its metal blade could be sharpened quickly against stone. Its short handle made it usable in trenches where a rifle was too long. Its weight allowed it to crush as well as cut. Soldiers practiced with it not out of enthusiasm, but because they were told they would eventually need it. Many of them did. American soldiers encountered this reality most often during nighttime engagement. Patrols sent to probe German lines sometimes returned shaken, reporting hand-to-hand encounters that ended before a shot could be fired. In the darkness, confusion reigned. A sudden shape emerged. A quick movement followed, and a man fell. When Americans examined the aftermath, they sometimes found a shovel lying nearby, its edge darkened, its purpose unmistakable. These incidents were disturbing not only because of their brutality, but because they challenged assumptions about modern warfare. The idea that a simple tool could be so decisive unsettled soldiers who believed superiority in weapons guaranteed safety. Despite these experiences, American doctrine remained largely unchanged. The U.S. Army was enormous, and changing training across millions of men was no small task. Officers prioritized coordination, artillery support, and mechanized strength. The folding shovel was acknowledged as a useful piece of equipment, but its role was fixed in manuals as an entrenching tool. Officially, it existed to help soldiers survive artillery fire by shaping the ground. The notion of formally training soldiers to use it as a weapon was rarely discussed and almost never endorsed. This disconnect created moments of vulnerability. In cramped environments like stairwells, basements, and narrow trenches, American soldiers often found themselves at a disadvantage. Rifles snagged on debris, bayonets required space to be effective, pistols were not always drawn quickly enough. German soldiers, conditioned to transition instantly, reached for what they knew would work. The Klappspaten was already in their hands, already familiar. It was not hesitation that decided those encounters, but preparation. Some American units began to learn informally. Combat has a way of teaching lessons faster than classrooms ever could. Veterans who survived close encounters sometimes sharpened their own shovels in quiet defiance of doctrine. They shared tips with trusted comrades, explaining grip, balance, and the importance of surprise. These lessons spread unevenly, dependent on experience rather than policy. They remained unofficial, passed along like whispered secrets, rather than formal instruction. There was also a psychological barrier. Many American soldiers were uncomfortable with the idea of using a shovel as a weapon. Firearms created distance, both physical and emotional. A shovel erased that distance. It required looking directly at the enemy, feeling resistance, and accepting a level of intimacy that training rarely addressed. German soldiers, conditioned from the start to accept this closeness, approached it with grim practicality. For them, it was not a moral question, but a matter of survival. Captured German training materials later revealed how deliberate this preparation had been. Diagrams showed strikes, grips, and movements designed for confined spaces. Instructors emphasized speed and decisiveness. Hesitation was discouraged, not through encouragement, but through repetition until actions became automatic. The shovel was not glorified but normalized. It was simply another option, no different in principle from a knife or bayonet. American officers who studied these materials often focused on the physical design of the Klappspaten rather than its role in training. Reports praised the folding mechanism, the strength of the blade, and the efficiency of its storage. Recommendations were made to improve American designs to strengthen hinges or reduce weight. Rarely did these reports suggest changes to how soldiers were taught to think about their equipment. The emphasis remained on improving objects rather than altering mindsets. As urban combat intensified, especially in heavily damaged cities, the limitations of this approach became clearer. Buildings collapsed into narrow corridors of rubble. Staircases twisted and broke. Rooms became caves of brick and dust. In such environments, long weapons were liabilities. German troops, accustomed to this chaos, moved with a different confidence. They expected sudden contact and were prepared for it. American troops often adapted on the fly, learning through loss, rather than instruction. The difference extended beyond individual encounters. German defensive tactics often relied on creating conditions where close combat was inevitable. Narrow trenches, choke points, and obstacles forced attackers into confined spaces. In these places the Klappspaten excelled. It required no ammunition, made little noise, and could be used repeatedly without maintenance. American reliance on firepower sometimes faltered when space or surprise removed its advantages. This was not a matter of courage or skill, but of preparation. American soldiers were brave, adaptable, and resourceful. When forced into close combat, they fought fiercely, but they were rarely given the tools, mentally or physically, to embrace such fighting as a planned possibility. The folding shovel remained symbolically separate from combat, even when reality contradicted that separation. Some veterans later reflected that the war taught them the value of improvisation more than any manual ever had. They learned that survival depended on flexibility, on seeing potential where none was intended. For those who adopted the German mindset late in the war, the shovel became something different. It was no longer just a tool for digging, but a reminder that the battlefield did not respect categories. Anything could become decisive if the soldier understood how to use it. Yet these lessons arrived too late to influence the broader American approach during the conflict. The war moved relentlessly forward, consuming men and material at an unprecedented scale. Institutional change lagged behind lived experience. The Klappspaten continued to be studied as an object, not as part of a philosophy. Its true power remained tied to the soldiers who had been taught to think differently from the start. In the end, the second phase of this story is one of mistranslation. America understood what the Germans carried, but not fully why they carried it the way they did. The folding shovel was copied, issued, and used, but stripped of the brutal intent that made it effective in desperate moments. German soldiers had been prepared to fight when everything failed. American soldiers were prepared to prevent that failure. When prevention fell short, the difference became painfully clear, written not in reports or diagrams, but in the silent aftermath of close combat encounters, where a simple folding shovel decided who walked away and who did not. By the final months of the war, the folding shovel rested in American packs like an unanswered question. It had traveled across oceans, through training camps, into foxholes and shattered cities. Yet its deeper meaning remained largely untouched. Soldiers carried it because they were told to, not because they believed in it as anything more than a tool. Meanwhile, German forces, even as defeat loomed, continued to treat the Klappspaten with the same grim respect they always had. It was never about innovation at the end. It was about habit formed early and reinforced by experience. The difference between the two armies was no longer theoretical. It had been tested repeatedly in blood, silence, and confined spaces where doctrine dissolved and instinct took over. As Germany collapsed, Allied troops moved through abandoned positions, supply dumps, and training grounds. They found stacks of Klappspaten, many visibly worn in ways that digging alone could not explain. Edges were smoothed from repeated sharpening, handles darkened where hands had gripped them tightly again and again. These shovels told stories without words. They spoke of preparation, of acceptance that combat might strip a soldier down to the simplest object and demand everything from him in return. American soldiers saw these artifacts with curiosity, sometimes admiration, but rarely with full understanding. To them, the war was ending, and survival no longer depended on adapting to such extreme. After the fighting stopped, analysis began. Military historians, officers, and engineers pored over equipment, tactics, and outcome. The German folding shovel appeared in reports as an example of compact design and multifunctional efficiency. Its ability to fold neatly and reduce a soldier's profile was praised. Recommendations were made for future American entrenching tools, many of which would closely resemble the Klappspaten in form. Once again, the focus stayed on the object itself, the underlying philosophy. The willingness to treat every piece of equipment as a potential weapon remained largely absent from official conclusions. Veterans, however, carried different memories. Some remembered moments when they wished they had been trained differently, when they realized too late that close combat did not follow the rules they had been taught. Others remembered German prisoners who spoke casually about using shovels in combat, not with pride, but with resignation. To them, it had simply been another skill, learned because war demanded it. These conversations rarely made their way into doctrine, but they lingered in personal reflections, shaping how individuals understood what they had lived through. In the years that followed, the American military evolved rapidly. New technologies emerged, from improved firearms to advanced vehicles and communication systems. The lessons of World War II were filtered through the lens of modernization. Close combat training existed, but it focused on standardized weapons designed specifically to kill. Improvised tools remained peripheral. The folding shovel continued to be issued, refined in materials and locking mechanisms, but its role stayed unchanged. It was still an entrenching tool first and last, despite the quiet history attached to its shape. Germany's experience, stripped of ideology and examined purely in terms of survival training, offered a stark contrast. The Klappspaten had never been intended as a symbol. It became one because it embodied a mindset that accepted chaos as inevitable. German soldiers were taught not to rely solely on systems, but on personal readiness to act when systems failed. That readiness was uncomfortable, even brutal, but it was honest. It acknowledged that war could reduce human beings to moments where there was no room for distance or hesitation. America's strength lay elsewhere. Its doctrine emphasized overwhelming force, coordination, and technological superiority. These principles worked, and they won the war. Yet they also created blind spots. When everything functioned as planned, there was no need to think about shovels as weapons. When plans unraveled, the lack of preparation became apparent. The folding shovel exposed this gap, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. It revealed how assumptions shape behavior under pressure. As decades passed, the Klappspaten faded into historical footnotes, mentioned occasionally in books or documentaries as a curious detail of German equipment. Its reputation as a weapon survived mostly in anecdotes shared among enthusiasts and historians who studied the grittier aspects of infantry combat. For the broader public, the idea remained surprising, even shocking. A shovel was supposed to dig, not kill. That reaction itself reflected the same mindset that had limited American understanding during the war. The true lesson of the folding shovel was never about copying or failing to copy a design. It was about understanding why a design mattered in the first place. Germany did not turn a shovel into a weapon because it was clever, but because it accepted that soldiers might need to fight with whatever they had. America copied the physical form without fully embracing that acceptance. In doing so, it gained the convenience but missed the intent. This difference did not diminish American soldiers or their sacrifices. They fought with courage, adaptability, and resilience under unimaginable conditions, but it highlighted how training shapes perception. What a soldier is taught to see as possible becomes possible. What he is taught to ignore remains invisible, even when it hangs at his side. The Klappspaten was visible to American eyes, but its purpose as a weapon remained unseen. In the end, the story of the folding shovel is not about metal or hinges. It is about mindset. Germany's soldiers were conditioned to see war stripped of illusion, where survival depended on readiness for the worst. America's soldiers were conditioned to believe in preparation through structure and firepower. Both approaches had strengths, but only one fully addressed the moment when everything fell apart. That is why the story matters, not because America copied Germany's Klappspaten, but because in doing so, it revealed a deeper truth about warfare. You can copy an object perfectly and still miss its soul. You can issue the same tool to millions of men and get entirely different results based on what they are taught to believe about it. The folding shovel became a weapon not through design alone, but through expectation. When the last shots of the war faded, the Klappspaten Klappspaten lay quietly among the relics of a defeated army. The American folding shovel lay beside it, nearly identical in shape, yet carrying a different history. One had been trained into a weapon, the other had remained a tool. Between them stood a lesson written not in manuals, but in experience. Wars are not won only by what you build, but by how you teach people to think when nothing works as intended. And that is where the story truly ends, not on a battlefield, but in reflection. A simple folding shovel showed that survival favors those who prepare for the most uncomfortable possibilities. America learned many lessons from the war, but this one remained subtle, almost invisible. The steel was copied, the hinge was copied. But the reason the Germans used it as a weapon, the acceptance that anything could become lethal if the moment demanded it, was never fully carried over. In that quiet omission lies the lasting power of the Klappspaten story, a reminder that the deadliest advantage is not always found in factories or blueprints, but in the way a soldier is taught to see the world when the fight becomes personal. The story could have ended there, but its shadows stretched far beyond 1945. Long after uniforms were folded away and battlefields turned into memorials, the quiet lesson of the folding shovel lingered in ways few people openly discussed. Veterans carried it into civilian life, sometimes without realizing why certain memories stayed sharper than others. They remembered the weight of tools in their hands, the feel of cold metal, and the realization that survival had often depended on decisions made in seconds, not on grand strategies drawn on maps. For some, the Klappspaten became a symbol of that realization, even if they never used the word. In post-war interviews, a handful of American veterans spoke candidly about close combat, describing moments when training seemed suddenly inadequate. They talked about fear, confusion, and the instinct to grab whatever was closest. A few admitted they had sharpened their shovels after seeing what German soldiers could do with them. These confessions were usually framed as personal adaptations, not criticisms of the system. There was an unspoken understanding that the American way of war had worked overall, even if it left individuals unprepared for certain extremes. The folding shovel became a footnote in their stories, but a revealing one. Military thinkers occasionally revisited these accounts during later conflicts. In jungles, mountains, and urban environments, the same challenges resurfaced. Weapons jammed, visibility disappeared, distance collapsed. Manuals evolved, adding close combat training and emphasizing adaptability, yet the idea of fully integrating improvised tools as weapons remained uncomfortable. Modern armies preferred purpose-built solutions, tools designed explicitly for fighting. The lesson of the Klappspaten, that a mundane object could become decisive through mindset alone, clashed with a culture that trusted specialization and technology. Collectors and historians eventually preserved original German folding shovels in museums and private collections. Visitors often stared at them, surprised by their simplicity. Guides explained their design, sometimes mentioning their use in combat. Reactions ranged from fascination to disbelief. Many struggled to reconcile the image of a shovel with the reality of violence. That discomfort mirrored the same mental barrier that had existed during the war. It was easier to admire engineering than to confront what the engineering had enabled through training and intent. Meanwhile, American folding shovels continued to evolve. Lighter alloys, stronger hinges, ergonomic grips, all appeared over the decades. Each improvement focused on efficiency and durability. None addressed the deeper question of purpose beyond digging. The object survived, refined and modernized, but its identity remained unchanged. It was a tool for shaping the earth, not for confronting another human being. That distinction was deliberate, reflecting a continued preference for separating combat from utility whenever possible. The German experience, stripped of context and ideology, offered an uncomfortable mirror. The Klappspaten had become lethal not because it was meant to, but because soldiers were trained to accept that lethality might be demanded of them at any moment. This acceptance did not come from cruelty, but from realism shaped by previous wars and harsh doctrine. It was a worldview that refused to assume safety, even in routine tasks. The shovel was dangerous because the soldier carrying it was prepared for danger everywhere. Looking back, The contrast reveals how deeply philosophy influences outcomes. America believed in control through planning, coordination, and overwhelming force. Germany believed in endurance through adaptability and individual readiness. Both approaches produced results, but they diverged sharply in moments where control vanished. The folding shovel sat at the crossroads of those philosophies, an unassuming piece of steel that exposed what each side valued when stripped to essentials. The added irony is that America's industrial and logistical power could have easily supported broader training and improvised combat if the mindset had demanded it. The limitation was never material but conceptual. Teaching millions of soldiers to see every object as a potential weapon would have required acknowledging a level of chaos and intimacy in warfare that clashed with institutional comfort. It was easier to trust in superior weapons than to prepare for fighting with tools never meant for killing. Over time, the Klappspaten story transformed from a tactical lesson into a metaphor. Writers and analysts used it to illustrate how copying technology without understanding context leads to incomplete results. The shovel became an example cited alongside other cases where form was adopted but function misunderstood. Its story resonated because it was simple, tangible, and unsettling. It challenged the assumption that progress in war always comes from better machines rather than deeper preparation. For the soldiers who lived it, however, the lesson was never abstract. It was felt in the body, in the memory of tight spaces and sudden violence. The folding shovel represented the moment when theory collapsed and reality asserted itself. Whether used or merely witnessed, it left an impression that no report could fully capture. It reminded them that war, despite all its planning, could still demand the most primitive responses. In the end, adding more words does not change the core truth revealed by that small, folding blade of steel. America copied Germany's Klappspaten almost perfectly, yet missed why it mattered. The difference was not incompetence or ignorance, but choice. One side chose to prepare for the worst imaginable moments. The other chose to believe those moments could be avoided through strength and organization. History showed that both choices had consequences. The final image remains a quiet one. Two shovels lying side by side, nearly identical, forged from similar metal, designed with similar care. One carries the weight of a philosophy that expects collapse and prepares for it. The other carries the confidence of a system that believes collapse can be prevented. Between them lies the enduring lesson of the war. Objects do not decide outcomes on their own. The way people are taught to think about those objects, especially when everything else fails, is what ultimately turns steel into destiny.